A rain-soaked dusk at the edge of Denver. The clouds hung low and heavy, pressing a tired gray light over the city's forgotten edges. Christine Miller's battered Chevy truck rolled off the highway and rattled up to a rusty chain-link fence, the last of its gas blinking red on the dashboard. Every wiper swipe struggled to keep the windshield clear, but the world outside had already blurred. Distant neon, mud, pools of reflected sky. Shadow, her German shepherd, rode shotgun, silent except for the click of her collar when Christine took the turn too sharp. Shadow had learned, the hard way, that silence was safer. Her big sable head rested on Christine's thigh, and her eyes watched the world with that gentle, steady patience that used to make her indispensable on rescue missions. But tonight, the only thing that needed saving was Christine herself. Christine sat for a moment after killing the engine, fingers locked tight around the last few crumpled dollars she owned. Rain battered the roof in nervous bursts. She felt every muscle in her body tense against the weight of failure. The bankruptcy court letter still stuffed in the glove box. The voicemail from her landlord she hadn't listened to. The memories that came too fast and too sharp if she let herself sit too long. Shadow licked a spot just above Christine's knee, a reminder, wordless, that someone was still here. Christine blinked hard, jaw working, and reached for the battered door handle. The junkyard loomed ahead, towers of dead metal, broken dreams rusting in rows. It was the end of the road, but also, impossibly, the first place she'd felt anonymous enough to breathe. She ducked into the small office to pay for a few gallons of gas, heart racing. The man behind the counter, Silas Carter, looked up from his newspaper. Vietnam veteran, big hands, soft eyes. "You're late," he said, not unkindly. "Storm's coming heavier." Christine slid her last bills across the counter, careful not to meet his gaze. "Just need enough to get to the other side of town." Silas studied her, then let his eyes drift to the dog waiting outside, nose pressed to the glass. "She's a good-looking shepherd. Retired? Too gentle for the job. They let her go." Christine's voice was rough, half apology, half confession. Silas took his time counting the money, as if the world would slow for just a few more minutes if he did. Then he nodded toward the far end of the lot, where a hulking, mildew-streaked Winnebago sat buried beneath a tarp and a decade's worth of neglect. "Tell you what," he said, "I got something back there. RV's been sitting since '95. Folks used to come through, make memories, live a life. Now it's just waiting on rot. Give me $1. Promise me you'll make it mean something again. And she's yours. Gas, too." Christine looked out at the RV, a monument to lost time. She hesitated, shame prickling at her cheeks. But she was out of options. $1, she repeated. Silas nodded, folding the bill into his pocket. "Just one thing. Don't let the past decide how you use it. Give it a second chance, that's all I ask." Christine's hands trembled as she took the keys. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal for a heartbeat before stepping back out into the rain. Shadow met her at the door, tail low but wagging. Inside, the Winnebago stank of old mildew, gasoline, and broken things. Mold crept up the curtains. The floorboards sagged under every step, and a scattering of forgotten toys and Polaroids lay buried in the dust. Christine set her duffel on the cracked vinyl seat, closed her eyes, and tried to remember the last time a place had felt like it could hold her together. Shadow did her usual sweep, circling the narrow aisle, nose twitching at invisible secrets. She paused at a warped floorboard near the kitchenette, pressing her paw against it, then looked up at Christine as if to say, "Here, Here is where you start again. Christine dropped onto the edge of the faded mattress and let the exhaustion break over her. She pressed her hand against Shadow's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breathing. Outside, the rain thickened, turning the world into a haze of silver and neon. For the first time in months, Christine let herself cry, quiet and shuddering, face buried in the dog's warm fur. Shadow leaned in, unmoving, her presence a shield against the shame and the noise in Christine's mind. The Winnebago shuddered as the wind picked up, a reminder that everything, even the walls around her, might come apart in a storm. But Shadow stayed close, anchoring Christine to this broken space. When Christine finally slept, it was shallow and restless, her mind full of echoes. Laughter from years ago, the soft scuff of tiny shoes on linoleum, a child's voice calling Mom. She woke to the smell of wet dog and old memories. Before dawn, Shadow began to pace again, her nose pressed to every seam and corner. Christine watched her for a moment, wondering what it must be like to trust so completely, to love without conditions or words. She reached out and ran her hand down Shadow's back, letting the dog's warmth ground her. "We're still here," she whispered. Shadow circled the RV once more, then settled at Christine's feet. Her eyes were bright, alive with a gentle alertness, as if she already sensed something buried beneath all this ruin. Christine sat in the hush, listening to the soft, persistent sound of rain against the roof, and felt, almost, like she might still belong somewhere. Tomorrow would come, and with it, every ugly piece of the past. But tonight, in a junkyard at the edge of Denver, Christine and Shadow shared a broken sanctuary, and for the first time in a long while, hope felt possible. Even if it was just a sliver, even if it was just enough to get through one more night. The first night inside the old Winnebago brought no sleep, only a pale drift of consciousness that came and went with the rain. By morning, Christine's back ached from the cracked mattress, and the musty cold of the junkyard seeped through every seam. She stared at the low ceiling, watching water drops gather and slip down the paneled wall, and tried to will herself not to think. But memory came for her anyway. A battered box of unopened mail sat at her feet. She should have thrown it away, or burned it, but instead she dug through the stack with numb fingers, the familiar shape of guilt rising in her throat. There, an envelope addressed in her daughter's hand, postmarked 2 weeks ago. She turned it over once, then again, feeling the rough edge of shame scraping under her skin. Shadow watched from the foot of the mattress, ears half raised, sensing the storm even before Christine tore the letter open. The words inside were gentle but heavy, Sophie's handwriting looping across the paper, telling her mother what Christine had failed to ask. "I'm pregnant, Mom. It's a girl. I want to be excited, but it's hard when I don't know if you even want to hear from me. I hope you're okay. I hope you'll call. I hope—" Christine's hands shook as she read. It should have been joy, news of new life, the invitation to return. But all she felt was the ache of regret. She'd been gone so long, let so much fester in silence. The thought of holding her daughter's child, of standing in the light of Sophie's forgiveness, seemed as distant as the mountains beyond the city's edge. Rain still whispered across the roof, soft as breathing. Christine pressed the letter to her chest and let herself unravel, sobs catching in her throat, raw and jagged. She tried to hold them in, but they came anyway. Every broken promise, every missed birthday, every word left unsaid building into a storm that Shadow couldn't outrun. The dog pressed close, her body a shield against the cold. Christine curled her fingers into the fur at Shadow's neck and wept, the sound swallowed by the walls. The world outside was quiet, but inside she broke open, all the old pain flooding in. I'm nothing but a burden, a shadow on someone else's life. The thought circled, mean and sharp. Sophie's better off without me. Everyone is. Shadow's tail flicked, then stilled. She nudged her nose against Christine's chin, insistent. Christine wiped her face on her sleeve, heart pounding, and tried to breathe. For a long time there was only the soft rhythm of Shadow's breathing and the wet hiss of wind through the leaking seams. Christine forced herself up, hands shaking, desperate for distraction. She moved through the narrow aisle, searching for something, anything, to fix or clean or repair. But the work only filled her hands, not her head. Midday brought no sun, only a thicker gray light. Christine's mind wandered to the box of Polaroids she'd found the night before. She rummaged through the clutter by the broken sink, fingers closing around a corner of torn carpet. Shadow watched, tail twitching, then pressed her nose to the spot, whining softly. "What's got you so riled up?" Christine muttered, irritation flickering through her fatigue. Shadow scratched at the floorboard, nails clicking, insistent. Christine knelt, brushing aside dust and debris. Her patience wore thin, but Shadow's intensity held her in place. She pried at the warped edge until, with a reluctant groan, the board came loose. Beneath it, a battered tin box, edges rusted, the metal cold against her palm. Christine held her breath as she unlatched it. Inside, a faded photo album, pages stuck together with time. She opened it, expecting nothing, only to be met by a flood of old smiles, sunburned faces. A family at rest and at play in the very RV she now called home. Kids with gap-toothed grins, a woman with sunlight in her hair, a dog curled at someone's feet, an entire history of strangers who once found joy here. Christine ran her thumb over the images. In each, she could feel the pulse of something lost, but also something enduring. She saw laughter, warmth, the simple hope of belonging. The ache inside her changed shape, no longer sharp and lashing, but slow and deep, settling under her ribs. For a moment, she let herself believe it might be possible to matter again, to take this ruin, this relic of someone else's happiness, and make it into something Sophie's child could inherit. Maybe if she could rebuild this place, if she could fix what was broken, she could prove she was worth coming home to. Her tears slowed as she lingered over the last page. A Christmas morning, light streaming through the Winnebago's window. A dog not unlike Shadow wearing a crooked paper hat. Christine laughed, the sound thin but real, and pressed her forehead to the album's cover. Shadow eased closer, her body warm against Christine's legs. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of quiet understanding. Christine whispered, barely more than a breath, "Maybe I can still give Sophie something that matters." Outside, the rain had begun to ease. Christine set the album beside the mattress and let her hand rest on Shadow's head, drawing strength from the steady thump of the dog's heartbeat. Tomorrow, there would be more storms, inside and out. But tonight, there was a thread of hope running through the darkness, just enough to tie her to the world, to Shadow, and to the future she'd nearly lost. In the stillness of the junkyard, beneath the battered roof and the broken dreams, something small and precious began to mend. The days bled together, soft and colorless, blurring at the edges like the memory of a life Christine could almost remember, but never fully grasp. Each morning, the junkyard roused her before the sun, rain clicking on the Winnebago's roof, distant clang of Silas's tools in the cold, oil-scented wind weaving through broken fenders and mountains of old scrap. She woke stiff and sore, but always to Shadow's patient gaze, the dog already sitting at the battered door, ready for whatever scraps of purpose the day would offer. Cleaning out the RV started as necessity, but became ritual, a way to keep her hands busy, to fill the empty spaces that threatened to swallow her whole. She worked in silence at first, scraping grime from cabinets, scrubbing ancient coffee stains from the countertops, piling broken dishes into bags that rattled like bones. Shadow followed her everywhere, never more than a breath away. Her paws leaving clean tracks in the dust, Christine swept away. Sometimes Christine caught herself talking to the dog, at first in a low, self-mocking tone, then simply because it felt better than talking to the shadows. "Bet you never figured you'd end up in a dump like this, huh?" she muttered as she pried at a rusted hinge. Shadow only tilted her head, ears flicking forward, as if she understood and forgave. It was slow work. The air inside the Winnebago was thick with the smell of rot, the past woven into the very fabric of the place. There were days when Christine's hands shook so badly she could barely hold a sponge, when panic rose up from nowhere, tightening her chest, sending her heart racing. She would stop then, crouch on the floor with her back pressed to the cool metal, pressing the heels of her palms into her eyes, waiting for the world to come back into focus. And always, without a word, Shadow would ease beside her, her body a solid, unmoving line of comfort. In the quiet moments, when the sun finally broke through the clouds and lit the dust motes spinning in the air, Christine found herself talking aloud. She talked about the little things first, the best way to get mold out of curtains, the way her old woodworking shop used to smell of cedar and varnish, the sound of Sophie's laugh on late summer evenings. Gradually, she let out pieces of herself she hadn't shared with anyone in years, the way she missed her father's big, calloused hands guiding hers along the grain of oak, the way fear could close a life off 1 inch at a time, until even hope seemed like a memory. Shadow listened without judgment, a quiet witness to Christine's unraveling. The dog's steady presence let Christine reach deeper, talk about the guilt that still woke her in the dark, the jobs she'd lost, the arguments she could never undo, the ache of loving and failing the people who needed her most. Late one afternoon, when her head pounded from exhaustion and the air outside was sharp with cold, Christine pried open the warped cabinet above the driver's seat. Something heavy tumbled onto the table, a wooden box, battered but intact. Her hands went still as she ran her thumb along the lid, feeling the smooth grooves carved into the top. There, half hidden under dust and old paint, were the initials HM burned deep into the wood. Her father's mark. The breath left Christine's chest in a single, silent gasp. She lifted the lid with trembling hands and found her old woodworking toolkit inside, each piece carefully wrapped in a faded rag. She remembered these tools, the weight of the chisel in her palm, the way the mallet fit her grip, the tiny file her father said could make anything smooth if you just had patience. They smelled of oil and memory. She sat at the little dinette, turning each tool over in her hands, letting their familiarity ground her. "Dad," she whispered, voice cracking. "I thought I lost you too." Shadow nudged her arm, insistent but gentle. Christine let out a shaky laugh and wiped her face with the back of her wrist, smearing dust and tears together. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it. Not just grief, but the weight of love that ran beneath it. The knowledge that every scar she carried was proof of caring, of trying, of surviving. She worked late into the evening that night, her hands steadier than they had been in months. She scrubbed the grime from the little table, set out her father's tools, and began patching up a broken cabinet door with quiet, careful patience. Shadow curled beside her feet, snoring softly. Outside, the wind battered the junkyard, but inside, the world was slow and safe. Christine found herself humming a tune she hadn't thought of since childhood, something her mother used to sing when the world was falling apart, and there was nothing to do but keep moving. By the time she finally set her tools aside, the Winnebago looked almost hopeful. Light from the little overhead bulb made the walls glow soft gold. The smell of bleach had faded, replaced by cedar oil and old leather. Christine leaned back in the dinette, shoulders aching but lighter than she could remember. She looked around at the space she was making, flawed, patched, but undeniably hers. For the first time in too long, she felt a flicker of pride, small but real, settle in her chest. She pressed her hand to Shadow's side, letting the dog's slow, steady breathing remind her that broken things could be made whole, that effort itself could be a kind of forgiveness. She turned off the lights, crawled into bed, and listened to the sound of Shadow settling at her feet. The junkyard outside was silent except for the distant rumble of trucks on the highway, the occasional bark of a dog far off, and the quiet pulse of her own heart. No longer racing, but steady, hopeful. Christine closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for a little while, that she was building something worth coming home to. In the darkness, the Winnebago cradled her, and the storm outside became a lullaby. The world was not fixed, but it was changed, and Christine, with Shadow by her side, was changing with it. One small, hard-earned piece at a time. Morning slipped in slow and uncertain, a gray hush pressing on the roof of the Winnebago. Christine lay awake for a long time, listening to the far-off clatter of the junkyard and the gentle thump of Shadow's tail against the cupboard every time she shifted in bed. There was a tired peace in this waking, not the anxious ache of old, but the kind of stillness that follows a sleepless night after grief, where every sound seems closer, every moment stretched thin by memory and hope. She sat up slowly, arms wrapped around her knees, letting the chill find its way into her bones. Outside, the world was washed in weak sun. Silas's battered Ford rattled past, and somewhere a radio played scratchy country music through an open garage door. Christine thought about her daughter, about Sophie's growing belly, the quiet hope in that letter. She had read it again last night, mouthing the words as if they were a spell or a prayer for forgiveness. The space inside the RV was transformed, if only a little. Dishes dried neatly on the rack. The cabinets stood repaired, lined with faded contact paper she'd scavenged from a thrift box out back. Christine moved through the space as though learning a new dance, careful not to disturb the delicate order she'd made from the chaos. She poured herself coffee, black and bitter, letting the steam curl up toward the skylight. Shadow nudged her knee, eyes bright, and Christine set a crust of bread on the saucer for her companion. "You keep me honest," she murmured. Shadow licked her hand, tail thumping once, then sat patiently as Christine opened the door. The yard outside was waking too, Men in greasy overalls wrestling an engine block onto a cart. Silas cursing good-naturedly at the rust. A pair of boys throwing pebbles at a cracked hubcap, seeing who could get the loudest clang. Christine watched for a moment before stepping down, the cold biting through the soles of her boots. It was a Saturday. She could have spent it inside, but she felt a restless need to move, to prove, to herself, to Shadow, maybe even to the silent ghosts of her family, that she could still be useful, still needed somewhere in this world. She pulled on a flannel shirt, rolled up her sleeves, and made her way across the lot, Shadow trailing at her side. Silas met her at the open garage, wiping his hands on a rag that had long since given up any pretense of being clean. "Morning," he said, his voice rough but warm. "Was just thinking I could use an extra set of hands. That old tow truck out back, starter's gone. Couldn't pay you much, but—" Christine shook her head. "Don't want pay," she said quietly. "Just something to do." Silas nodded, understanding in his eyes. He handed her a socket wrench, and together they fell into the easy rhythm of shared labor. The work was hard, honest, and mostly silent. Christine's fingers remembered more than she thought: how to coax rusted bolts, how to work around stripped threads, how to listen for the change in the engine's song that meant something was finally right. Shadow lay in the shade, watching every move, rising now and then to nose around the edge of the lot or bark at a squirrel darting through the weeds. Midday brought a moment of stillness. Silas poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs and handed one to Christine. "You don't talk much," he said, not unkindly. "World's full of noise, I guess." Christine took a sip, nodding. She didn't trust her voice with the weight of gratitude, so she let the silence hold it. The peace was broken when a sharp cry echoed from the fence line. A girl, no more than 8 or 9, stood pressed against the chain link, her jeans streaked with mud, a knapsack hanging from one strap. Her face was pinched, cheeks red from running, eyes wide. "My dog, she's stuck. Please, somebody help." Silas froze, glancing to Christine, but Shadow was already moving, slipping past the barrels and tangled wire, drawn by the girl's panic. Christine dropped her mug and followed, heart hammering. The far end of the lot was choked with weeds and scrap. The girl pointed, sobbing. "There! She went under! She won't come out!" Christine crouched beside her, seeing a small terrier trapped beneath a fallen tire rim. The animal's sides heaved, eyes rolling with fear. Shadow moved in first, her body low, posture gentle, ears soft, as if to say, "You're not alone." Christine dropped to her knees. "Easy now. Let's move slow." She worked with careful hands, lifting the rim just enough. Shadow holding the terrier's gaze with her own calm steadiness. The little dog scrambled free and leapt into the girl's arms, whimpering, safe. The girl clung to her pet, tears streaking her face. "Thank you," she whispered, voice hoarse. Christine brushed a hand across her own cheek, embarrassed by the sudden prickle in her eyes. "You did good, calling for help," she managed, voice rough. Shadow circled the two, nose nudging the girl's elbow. The girl giggled through her tears, burying her face in her dog's fur. For a moment, the world shrank down to 3 humans, 2 dogs, and a single quiet relief that trembled between them like hope. Silas arrived, breathless, grinning despite himself. "Looks like you got it handled." Christine nodded, standing slow, brushing dirt from her knees. The girl's mother soon appeared at the fence, calling her home, her own relief breaking the tension. Back in the Winnebago that night, Christine washed her hands at the little sink, watching the dirt swirl away. She turned the water off, leaning into the hush, her body aching but her heart strangely light. Shadow jumped up on the bed, curling into a tight ball. Christine sat beside her, stroking the soft fur, letting the day settle inside her. Outside, the wind was rising again, rattling the windows, but inside, the space felt warmer than before. Christine pulled the old Polaroid album from the cupboard, opened it to the page with the Christmas morning light, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to hope, not just for forgiveness, but for the simple gift of being needed, being useful, being seen. Shadow pressed closer, sighing into sleep, and Christine let herself drift, wrapped in a quiet she'd fought so long to find. Tonight, she would not dream of the past. She would hold only this, a small victory, a rescued dog, the slow mending of a heart once thought beyond repair. A hard rain swept across the city that night, beating on the metal roof of the Winnebago like 1,000 small regrets. Christine drifted in and out of sleep, her mind restless, caught between the shadowed memory of Sophie's letter and the soft warmth of Shadow curled at her feet. Outside, the junkyard shimmered with puddles, every street lamp reflected and broken by wind. The lot turned to rivers of mud. By morning, the sky had not cleared. The clouds pressed close, heavy as grief. Christine pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and watched droplets gather at the window's edge, tracing their uncertain path toward the warped sill. For a long while, she let herself be still, her thoughts winding back to the rescue the day before. The frightened girl, the little dog, the way Shadow had led by quiet example. She held on to that small victory, though doubt kept clawing at the edges. Good deeds, she reminded herself. Don't erase the past. Silas knocked at the door just as Christine was boiling water for coffee. He stood in the rain, cap pulled low, and offered a thin smile. Got a call, he said, voice muffled by the wind. Storms washed out part of the highway. A truck overturned on 73, blocking the main road. Local folks can't get through and rescue's backed up. He hesitated. You know engines better than any of us? Thought maybe you'd want to help. Christine hesitated, the old uncertainty rising. But she saw something in Silas's eyes, a flicker of respect, maybe, or simply the hope that she might say yes. She set her mug aside. Let me grab my coat. Shadow was waiting by the door before Christine could even tie her boots. The two moved out into the rain together, falling into step with a quiet certainty that surprised them both. They reached the far gate where Silas's pickup idled, already muddy to the doors. Two more men waited, strangers to Christine, one wiry, one broad, both with the same anxious tilt to their shoulders. They looked at her, then at the dog, unsure, but too pressed for time to ask questions. They rode in silence along the winding road. The city fell away, replaced by wet fields, water pooling along fence lines and in the ruts of old tracks. Christine watched the world pass, her reflection faint in the glass, Shadow's steady eyes always just at the edge of her vision. The roadblock appeared around a bend. An old moving van tipped sideways, nose buried in the ditch, mud to the axles. Its cargo, someone's life boxed up in cardboard, was scattered through the ditch and across the shoulder. A woman stood in the downpour, her hands pressed to her face. Christine could see a child's car seat in the back of a little hatchback trapped behind the truck, a toddler's pale hand against the window. The men began to argue, about chains, leverage, winches, and ropes, voices rising and falling in the storm, frustration riding every word. Christine moved quietly around them, scanning the mess, listening to the engine's quiet ticking. Shadow padded beside her, nose to the wind. Christine crouched in the mud, letting the noise wash over her, and ran her hands beneath the undercarriage. She could feel the tension in the frame, the way the weight pressed the van deeper with every passing minute. The rain picked up, stinging her face. She tried not to think about Sophie or about her own hands trembling with cold. But she could not stop remembering the feeling of being the one left out, the one who could only watch while others fixed what she had broken. Shadow nuzzled her elbow, bringing her back to the present. Christine looked up at Silas. "If you can get the chain on the axle, I think I can rock it enough for you to pull. Someone needs to brace the wheel here." She pointed, voice calm, eyes steady. The others followed her lead, hesitating at first, then moving as if relief came simply from having someone tell them what to do. They worked in silence, their movements sure and careful. The van groaned as the winch took hold, the mud sucking at its tires, the cargo shifting with a dull crash. Christine braced her feet and leaned in, shoulder to metal, willing the world to move. The chain snapped once, then caught. The men shouted, the engine roared, and with one last heave the van lurched free, tilting upright just enough for the hatchback to squeeze past. The mother inside wept openly, pressing her hands to the glass, mouthing thank you again and again. Christine stepped back, wiping rain from her face with the back of her hand, her arms aching, her breath ragged. She watched as the toddler waved a chubby hand through the fogged window. Small, perfect, a reminder of all the beginnings she thought she'd never see again. They stayed to help clear the debris, gathering waterlogged boxes and sodden blankets, the men talking softly now, their voices rough with gratitude and exhaustion. Silas handed Christine a thermos of coffee, his hands shaking. "Didn't know you had that in you," he said quietly. Christine shrugged, suddenly shy. "Just needed to do something that mattered." They drove back in near silence, the cab thick with the smell of wet dog and old engine oil. Christine rested her hand on Shadow's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath her palm. For a while she let the feeling settle, the rare, trembling pride that comes from being useful, from saving something, no matter how small. Back at the Winnebago, she stripped off her soaked coat and hung it by the heater. Shadow shook herself dry, flopping onto the mattress with a contented sigh. The rain still fell, gentler now, but steady, a reminder that storms always pass in the end. Christine pulled Sophie's letter from the shelf and read it once more, letting the words move through her like sunlight after rain. She pressed the page to her chest and looked at Shadow, who met her gaze with soft, steady eyes. Outside, the world was still battered and gray, but inside, Christine felt, if only for a moment, like something had shifted. She was no longer just surviving. She was starting piece by piece to come back to herself. After the highway rescue, something in the rhythm of Christine's days changed. Not with fanfare or sudden forgiveness, but in the quiet, unnoticed ways life begins to mend. People in the junkyard started to greet her with a nod. One man left a paper bag of groceries at her door. Another dropped off a can of kerosene and a smile that said, "Thank you," more clearly than words. She began to feel their regard settling around her like an old coat, unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Still, night brought its own storms. Christine would lie awake, her mind drifting back through all she'd lost, the house, the shop, The years when Sophie needed her most, and she'd been too tired, too angry, too broken to show up. Even now, with the world a little softer, the past trailed behind her like a cold wind, sharp enough to sting. One morning, she found Shadow waiting by the door, posture tense, gaze fixed on something in the near distance. At first, Christine thought it was just another stray cat or raccoon nosing through the trash. But as she stepped outside, she saw a small, battered car idling at the edge of the lot, its engine coughing in the cold. The driver's window rolled down. Sophie. Christine froze. Sophie looked older, her belly rounded beneath a loose sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy knot. For a moment, neither moved. Then Sophie offered a tentative smile, equal parts hope and uncertainty. "I was passing through," Sophie called softly. "Didn't know if I should stop." Christine's throat closed around words she couldn't find. She wiped her hands on her jeans, heart pounding in her chest. Shadow, sensing the tension, trotted forward and stood between them, tail still but eyes gentle, as if mediating something fragile. "You look good," Christine managed, her voice rough. She wanted to say more. Wanted to say, "I missed you. I'm sorry. I love you." But the words caught. Old habits anchoring her to silence. Sophie stepped out of the car, arms wrapped around her belly. She stood close, but not too close, her eyes glancing past Christine at the Winnebago, at the work Christine had done. She nodded at the old RV. "You made it nice." Christine shrugged, looking down. "Trying to fix what I can." A long moment hung between them, filled with everything they could not say. Then Sophie surprised her. She laughed, a sound both familiar and new. "Remember when we built that birdhouse? You let me paint it purple and I got more paint on the porch than on the wood." Christine smiled, real, unguarded. "We kept it for years. Birds didn't mind the color." Shadow broke the tension, nosing Sophie's hand, tail giving a hopeful wag. Sophie knelt awkwardly and stroked the dog's head, letting her fingers tangle in the fur. "She's beautiful," she whispered, and Christine saw the tears standing in her daughter's eyes. There were no grand apologies, no sudden reconciliations. Instead, they walked slowly through the junkyard, Shadow weaving between them. Sophie told stories about the baby, about her job at the market, about little fears and tiny hopes. Christine listened, learning her daughter's life in small pieces, letting the distance close inch by inch. The sky cleared as they walked. The rain-washed air smelled of rust and pine. Christine led Sophie to the RV, poured her tea from a chipped mug, and pulled out the old photo album. They paged through memories, birthdays, holidays, grainy Polaroids of another world. Sophie lingered over a picture of herself as a child, sitting cross-legged beside a younger Christine, both smiling, faces smudged with cake. "I want her to know you," Sophie said softly, tracing her finger over the faded print. "My daughter. I want her to have something from before, something that lasts." Christine looked at her hands, stained and strong from months of work, and felt the ache in her chest give way, just a little, to something softer. "I want that too," she whispered. Shadow, sensing the shift, hopped onto the bed and leaned against Sophie, who laughed and pressed her cheek to the dog's fur. The sound filled the small space with a warmth that no storm could touch. The visit was short. Sophie left before the sun set, promising to call soon, promising to return. Christine stood at the edge of the lot and watched the car disappear down the muddy road. When it was gone, she wiped her face with the heel of her hand and looked down at Shadow, who met her gaze with a calm certainty. That night, Christine worked late into the quiet, fixing a drawer that stuck, oiling the hinges on the Winnebago door. She found herself humming, a little off-key, the melody from a lullaby she used to sing to Sophie when the world seemed too big. Shadow curled beside her, content. Later, Christine sat at the dinette with a pen and a fresh page. She began a letter, unsure where it would end up. Maybe in the mail, maybe tucked into a book for Sophie's daughter one day. She wrote about the junkyard, about storms, about old wounds and small lights. She wrote about Shadow, how love had come from the most unexpected places, how loyalty sometimes found you when you felt least deserving. By the time sleep claimed her, the wind outside had faded to a gentle hush. Christine lay on her back, Shadow's warmth at her feet, and for the first time in a long time, she dreamed not of what she had lost, but of what might still be found. By the time October folded itself into November, the junkyard felt different. Christine's hands had grown surer. Calloused palms, strong grip, a steadiness to her step that hadn't been there at the start. Each morning began with the same simple things: coffee brewing, the rattle of the Winnebago's old furnace, the hush as she fed Shadow, then stood for a moment in the doorway, just breathing in the new day. But even in this quiet routine, the world had ways of reminding her how thin the veil of peace could be. It was just past dusk, the sky bruised purple and gold, when Christine heard shouting out beyond the stacks of twisted metal. She stepped outside, Shadow tense at her side, and caught the flicker of headlights bobbing at the fence line. Someone was banging on the gate, frantic, voice cracking in panic. She could make out a man's silhouette, mid-30s, clothes wrinkled and worn, a wildness in the way he moved. His pickup, caked in mud, idled behind him. He was alone except for a small, shaking shape in his arms, a black and tan puppy, limp as a rag, its breaths shallow, belly swollen and raw. Christine crossed the lot fast, Silas right behind her, flashlight in hand. "Please," the man gasped, voice thick with fear. "She's dying. I found her by the road. Please, can you help?" Shadow leaned in, nose twitching, already reading the story. The man's words could not tell. Christine gently pried the pup from his arms, heart pounding at the heat radiating from the tiny body, the smell of sickness and old road salt. She looked up at the man. "Vet's closed by now. You got any money?" He shook his head. I couldn't leave her." For a moment, Christine was back in the past. The sense of being helpless, watching someone small and voiceless slip away. But Shadow pressed her nose into Christine's palm, a nudge that steadied her. "Come on," Christine said, leading them all into the RV. She cleared a space on the bench and fetched a bowl of warm water, a battered first aid kit, towels. She moved quickly, giving orders the way her father once did. Calm, sure, as if there was nothing but time. The pup whimpered softly. Christine cleaned the grime from her fur, checked for wounds, let her hands search gently for the source of pain. The man hovered by the door, face pinched. "She just showed up, middle of the night. My wife," she said not to get involved. "But—" Christine heard the apology tangled in his voice and shook her head. "Sometimes all you can do is show up." She pressed her ear to the pup's chest, counted out the erratic heartbeats. "I think she's dehydrated. Could be parvo, could be poison. All we can do is keep her warm, keep trying." For the next hour, Christine sat beside the puppy, coaxing sips of water, wrapping her in a blanket, rubbing her ribs when her breathing grew shallow. Shadow watched, solemn, never taking her eyes off the small life in Christine's hands. Outside, the man paced and prayed, his voice barely above a whisper. Slowly, the storm inside the RV matched the storm outside. A hush, a holding of breath. The men from the junkyard gathered outside, unsure if they should come in, offering silent comfort in their way. One set a thermos of black coffee by the door. Another offered half a sandwich. Christine accepted everything, passing pieces of bread to the puppy, whispering old songs she remembered from Sophie's childhood. Hours slipped by, the world shrinking to the space between Christine's palm and the rise and fall of the puppy's chest. The pup's breaths steadied. Christine felt relief so strong it left her shaking. "She's fighting," she murmured. "That's all anyone can ask." The stranger slumped against the door, hands covering his face, his body racked with a silent, private grief. When he finally looked up, there were tears on his cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I've never been good with loss. I thought I could just fix her." Christine heard herself answer quietly. "Sometimes you can't fix everything. Sometimes it's enough just to stay." Dawn came gray and uncertain. The puppy slept, her breathing easier, belly softer beneath Christine's hand. The stranger gathered himself, stood, and met Christine's gaze. "Thank you," he said, voice almost too soft to hear. "For trying." He left as quietly as he'd come, pausing once to scratch Shadow behind the ears. The junkyard was waking, the world moving on. But Christine sat for a long while in the fading darkness. Shadow pressed close, listening to the soft pulse of life returning to the little creature in her arms. It was later, washing her hands in the weak morning light, that Christine saw her own reflection in the cracked mirror over the sink. She looked older, yes, but less haunted. She thought of the man's words, "Sometimes it's enough just to stay," and felt something shift inside her, a knot unwinding. She carried the puppy to the patch of sun by the window, letting Shadow curl beside them both. The world outside was still battered, uncertain, but here, in this small, bright corner, there was hope enough to last another day. The days that followed were carved out of a slow, honest routine. The rain eased, replaced by a cold, brittle wind that rattled the window panes of the Winnebago and scattered leaves like bits of burnt paper over the junkyard. Christine woke early now, sometimes before the sun. The small rescued puppy nestled against Shadow's side. Two shapes, large and small, breathing together in the thin light. Each morning, she'd make her way through the silence, warming her hands on a mug of coffee, listening for any sound from Sophie, though she knew it was too soon. Always too soon. She checked on the pup, who, with every passing day, grew a little stronger, a little steadier on her feet, her eyes brightening, ribs less visible beneath her patched coat. Shadow had taken on the role of guardian, rarely leaving her side, sometimes curling around her, as if she could shield the pup from all that had come before. Life outside pressed on. Trucks came and went at the edge of the yard. The men offered their nods, the bag of apples on her step. The wave from Silas as he tinkered with a radiator in the early frost. Christine moved among them quietly, not hiding, but not stepping forward either, still learning the weight of belonging. She mended things for Silas and for others who asked, an old clock, a stubborn generator, a wooden box someone's father had carved and forgotten. Each task was simple, requiring focus and patience. The men would linger nearby, never too close. Offering advice Christine never needed, but always pretended to consider, as if it mattered. Sometimes a story would slip out. About the town, about a brother lost to winter, about a dog from childhood that had run away but always found its way home. The words drifted in the cold, unfinished, and Christine listened, hands busy, head bowed, letting the stories fill the cracks that loneliness left behind. At night, she wrote letters she sometimes mailed, sometimes tucked away in a drawer. She told Sophie about the rescued puppy, about the work, about the way Shadow had become gentler with the cold, sleeping pressed against Christine's feet, sighing softly in the dark. She wrote about the men in the yard, about Silas's slow, gruff kindness, about the strangeness of being needed in small ways. She didn't write about regret, not directly. That was something she learned to shape with her hands instead, sanding a splintered table smooth, oiling the hinges on the Winnebago door, letting the past become something useful, something she could offer. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the piles of metal and the air turned sharp, a knock came at her door. Christine opened it to find the young mother from the rescue on the highway, her hair now washed, a little girl in tow, both bundled against the cold. The woman held out a jar of preserves, her face flushed with gratitude and embarrassment. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for stopping, for helping. We don't have much, but this is from our trees. My grandma used to say, sharing food is sharing hope." Christine took the jar, feeling the warmth of the woman's words more than the glass itself. She glanced at the girl, who hid behind her mother's legs, peeking at Shadow and the puppy tumbling in the small patch of grass by the steps. "They're beautiful," the mother said softly. "I used to have a dog like that when I was little. We lost her in a storm. I thought I'd never want another. But seeing them, I think maybe it's not about starting over. Maybe it's just about not turning away." The three of them stood in the dusk, awkward but honest. Christine smiled, small and real, and pressed the jar to her chest. "Thank you for coming back." The words felt new in her mouth. The woman nodded, her eyes shining. She led her daughter away, pausing once to wave. Shadow barked once, gentle, and the puppy yipped back, surprised at her own voice. Later, Christine sat with the preserves open, spooning a bit onto bread, savoring the sharp taste of plum and sugar and sunlight from another season. She ate slowly, Shadow's head resting on her knee, the puppy sprawled across her feet. She closed her eyes and let the quiet soak into her bones, felt the ache of old grief softening into something she could bear. Night fell thick and fast. Christine stepped outside, pulling her coat tight, and looked up at the wide, indifferent stars. She thought of her daughter, of hope in the shape of a baby not yet born, of mistakes and repairs, of all the small, ordinary mercies that had gathered here in the shadows of broken cars and old metal. Inside, Shadow shifted, the puppy settling against her. Christine lay down, feeling the warmth at her back, the softness of breath and fur and forgiveness. Tomorrow, there would be more to do. More repairs, more small kindnesses, more chances to listen and to stay. But for tonight, the world was enough. Quiet, imperfect, full of what remained when everything else had gone. She let herself sleep, wrapped in the hush of dogs and the memory of someone at the door, bringing a jar of hope to a stranger not so very different from herself. By mid-December, the first true snow arrived. It drifted down all night, blanketing the junkyard, turning each battered hood and rusted fender into soft white humps, erasing edges and blurring the harshness of metal. Christine woke to a world made gentle by silence. She stood at the Winnebago's narrow window, mug in hand, watching the sky lighten, a cold dawn full of promise and old longing. Shadow and the little pup, now sturdy enough to chase her own tail, wrestled in the patch of sunlight that spilled through the door. Christine watched them, heart aching with a strange, stubborn gratitude. The world outside might be battered, but here within these thin walls and narrow paths, life held together. She pulled on boots, stepped into the hush, and felt the snow crunch, clean and forgiving, beneath her feet. The junkyard had its own way of waking in winter. Men shuffled past, breath steaming, wool hats pulled low, voices quiet. Silas waved her over, wordlessly handing her a mug of sweet tea from his battered thermos. "Supposed to get colder tonight," he said, not looking at her, but standing a little closer than before. "You warm enough out there?" Christine nodded. "Better than I deserve." The words surprised her. Silas only grunted, but his eyes softened for a moment. Inside, she kept busy, insulating windows, lining the Winnebago's floor with old rugs, patching leaks with strips of plastic and hope. The puppy slept in a nest of blankets. Shadow curled around her like a moat. Christine read to them in the evenings, her voice rusty, warming with each page. She wrote letters to Sophie that grew longer, less careful, more honest. Her fears about the coming baby, her hopes that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness was finding its way between the lines. Then one morning, the world changed again. A phone call. Sophie's voice, trembling, uncertain. "Mom? It's happening. I'm at the hospital. I wanted to call you first." Christine's chest tightened with fear and awe. "I'll come," she whispered, and hung up before the panic could claim her. She packed quickly, a loaf of bread, the old photo album, her father's small carving knife. Shadow watched, tail still, sensing the shift. Christine knelt, pressing her face into Shadow's fur, whispering thanks, promises, hopes. She left the puppy in Silas's care. "She's yours for now," she said. And for the first time, Silas didn't argue. The drive into the city was a blur of white roads and worry, her hands clamped tight on the wheel. Her heart thudded in her chest, every memory of absence threatening to rise. At the hospital, the lights were harsh and bright. Christine waited in a plastic chair, counting her breaths, feeling her courage waver. Then Sophie was there, small, exhausted, radiant. She reached for her mother's hand. Christine took it, their fingers tangling, warmth passing between them in a silent benediction. Hours passed, measured by the sound of monitors, the slow rhythm of pain and waiting, the strange comfort of presence. When the baby came, Christine found herself weeping, tears slipping silent and unstoppable down her cheeks as Sophie pressed her daughter into Christine's arms. The child was warm and new and impossibly real, her tiny fist curled around Christine's finger. All the words Christine had never said seemed to move through her in that moment. Apology and hope, love and regret, woven together in the steady heartbeat of this small, sleeping life. Sophie looked up, eyes shining, and Christine saw her own longing and fear mirrored there. "Will you stay a while?" Sophie asked, voice small and unsure. Christine nodded, unable to speak. She held her granddaughter close, breathing in the sweet, milky scent, feeling something inside her, old hurt, old shame, soften and break. The room around her faded. There was only this, a child, a daughter, a second chance. For days, Christine stayed by Sophie's side, holding the baby, changing diapers, singing lullabies in a voice that trembled but never broke. She learned the patterns of hospital life, the carts rattling down the hall, the shift change murmur, the soft hush of snow outside the window. Each moment was a gift, fragile and real, as if life itself had slowed down to let her catch up. Shadow waited patiently in the junkyard, watching for Christine at dusk, keeping the puppy close. Silas checked the Winnebago each night, refilling the heater's kerosene, making sure nothing inside froze or faded. Christine called to check on them, her voice softening, her thanks growing steadier with each day. At last, Sophie and the baby were ready to come home. Christine drove them back, her hands less afraid, her heart full but no longer frantic. She watched as Sophie slept in the passenger seat, the baby dreaming in her basket, snow swirling across the windshield. Christine thought of all she had lost and all she had found. Forgiveness, hard-earned, never complete, but enough. That night, the junkyard shone beneath the streetlights. Gold on snow, dogs tumbling in the yard, laughter threading through the cold. Christine stood in the doorway of the Winnebago, baby in her arms, Shadow and the pup pressed close. The men from the yard lingered nearby, offering food, stories, the quiet comfort of community. Christine felt her world settle around her, imperfect, unfinished, lit by the smallest, steadiest lights. She pressed her cheek to the baby's head, her tears quiet now, her heart no longer racing but steady, at home. The new year came quietly, with no celebration, just snow falling in the yellow glow of the streetlights, muffling the junkyard and all its battered dreams. Christine stood at the threshold of the Winnebago, baby in her arms, Shadow at her feet, the little puppy grown rounder and bold, nosing through drifts for sticks and treasures only she could see. The world had gone slow, soft around the edges, as if winter itself was giving her permission to breathe and settle. Inside, the heater's hum blended with the tiny sounds of the newborn, grunts, the wet hiccup of a yawn, the gentle flutter of small fingers uncurling. Sophie slept curled up on the bunk, her face turned to the wall, exhaustion softening her features into something almost childlike. Christine sat beside her, touching her hair, and remembered every night she'd spent wishing to be forgiven. She looked down at her granddaughter, at the small rise and fall of the baby's chest, and felt her life come full circle in ways she could not have imagined a year before. Outside, the men from the yard shuffled past, their laughter rolling between the stacks of metal, not loud, but easy, and always. Now, there was a wave or a thermos left at the door. Silas had built a makeshift ramp for the Winnebago. For little feet, he'd grunted, though everyone knew it was just as much for old dogs and tired women. Christine's days filled with gentle patterns. She walked the yard with the baby bundled close, Shadow and the puppy circling, forging their own path through the snow. She patched a radio for Silas, taught one of the younger men to sharpen a blade, fixed the squeak in the door of the storage shed. Her hands were always busy, but her mind was steadier, the sharp angles of regret worn smooth by days spent in service to others. To animals, to the slow return of family. Sometimes at dusk, when the wind rattled the siding and the world felt thin, Christine would sit on the step with Sophie, baby pressed between them, and listen to the sounds of the yard. "She'll remember this," Sophie would say, her voice low. "Not the place, the feeling, the safety." And Christine would nod, holding that hope close, letting it root itself where the old sorrows once lived. There were still hard days, days when the heater failed and the pipes froze, when Sophie's exhaustion frayed her voice to rawness, when Christine's hands ached with old pain and she wondered if she'd ever really done enough. But even then, there was a difference. People came. Silas would knock, dropping off extra wood. The mother from the highway brought fresh bread and a pie, her daughter chasing the puppy until their laughter filled the yard. Once, a stranger left a basket of diapers and blankets at the step. No note, just a kindness passed from one wounded hand to another. Shadow grew older that winter, her muzzle touched with gray, her pace slower but her eyes never less gentle. The puppy grew bolder, teaching herself the boundaries of the yard, learning from Shadow which men to trust and which corners to avoid. Together, they formed a silent guard, a promise kept, a love that didn't ask for anything back. As the days lengthened and the snow began to shrink from the grass, Christine realized she no longer counted the hours by her failures or her loneliness. She counted them in small mercies: Sophie's laughter, the baby's sleepy sighs, the way Shadow and the pup curled at her feet when she wrote her letters late at night. She counted them in every thank you spoken and unspoken, every hand that reached out, and every gentle, ordinary meal shared between neighbors who, 6 months ago, might have walked past her as if she were invisible. One early afternoon, as the first green pressed through the mud, Christine stood beneath the open sky and looked at the world she had almost lost. She watched as Sophie placed the baby in a sling and walked the fence with the dogs, her voice weaving through the sharp March air. The men joked about the coming thaw. The little girl from the highway giggled as the puppy chased her through puddles. Shadow lifted her head and watched it all, wise and tired and content. Christine breathed in, feeling something unfamiliar and good, a peace that did not need to be earned or explained. She was not healed in the way stories sometimes promise, not transformed or unscarred, but real, present, loved enough. That night, after the baby fell asleep and Sophie whispered a quiet goodnight, Christine sat alone in the half-light, her journal open in her lap. She wrote slowly, her words small and sure. I have made mistakes. I have been lost. But I have found my way by loving and being loved in return. I have learned that what remains after the storm is not always what you hoped for, but sometimes it is enough. She set her pen down and looked at Shadow and the puppy sleeping close, at the basket holding her granddaughter's first breaths, at the battered table covered in mugs and crumbs and Polaroids. The junkyard, the snow, the long, slow days of winter. Each had given her back to herself, not as she once was, but as she was meant to be, imperfect, seen, and finally, quietly, at home. And as the dark settled gently over the world outside, Christine closed her eyes and let herself rest, content to be one small light in a world full of broken things, learning, always, how to shine.